And my guest this segment, as promised, is Joseph Plummer. He is the author of Tragedy and Hope 101, The Illusion of Justice, Freedom, and Democracy. In 2003, Joseph Plummer sold a successful internet-based business and, using the proceeds, embarked on a 10-year not-for-profit path. His goal: expose the appalling deception and crimes of the world's ruling elite. Now, 10 years later, Tragedy and Hope 101 represents the culmination of his efforts. Based on the groundbreaking research of Carroll Quigley, Tragedy and Hope 101 condenses Quigley's startling revelations into just a couple of 100 pages. If you've ever suspected that democratic governments, quote, and free markets, quote, can be secretly manipulated and controlled, this book will not only confirm your suspicions, it will show you how it's done. Joseph, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Good to be with you, Chuck. How you doing?
Good. Listen, this book, I am so pleased that you've put this together. I mean, I've had Tragedy and Hope sitting on my bookshelf for a while. It's as big as a phone book. Talk a little bit about who Carroll Quigley was and why we should care.
Well, Carroll Quigley was a well-respected historian who was, for all intents and purposes, an Ivy League insider. He received his Ph.D. from Harvard. He taught at Princeton. He taught at Georgetown University, and he was selected. There's argument over why he was selected, but he was selected by this group of insiders who was known by a couple different names, the Milner Group, organized by Rhodes, of course. He's the one that started the whole project of what was the exact quote he used? He wanted to control all habitable portions of the world. So he was selected by this group to kind of write their history and was allowed access to their papers. So here we're talking about an actual real-life conspiracy of individuals who sought to infiltrate government and institutions, both existing institutions and create institutions of their own that would enable them to maintain the illusion of democratic processes, but while they actually secretly controlled everything behind the scenes. He was allowed within this network of individuals to look at their secret work and see how everything operated. And he said himself that he was sympathetic to most of their aims. He believed in their good intentions. Again, now with regard to that, there is some evidence that towards the end he began to believe otherwise. But I haven't been able to verify that. But so
now we should point out.
Go ahead.
No, we should point out that Carroll Quigley was Bill Clinton's mentor, and Clinton mentioned him by name in his inaugural, in his acceptance speech, that he was his professor at Georgetown, and that Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. Now, Cecil Rhodes is the person who began this movement in modern times. I mean, we could deal with before Cecil Rhodes, but that's a subject for another book.
Sure.
And that he was a South African British royalist who viewed the idea of a union of the English-speaking nations of the world, the Anglo-Saxon American nations, to form the nucleus of a world order, and he called it that openly. He established secret societies that eventually spawned organizations in the capitals of most English-speaking nations, including the United States. So talk a little bit about that, how he got started, and how his organization came to dominate America and literally own America in the real sense.
Well, it began basically with, in my view, it began with the administration of Woodrow Wilson. And that's where they organized this group known as the Inquiry. And the Inquiry was this, elite group of intellectuals who were involved in forming all of the policies of the United States. I go through how they actually split the vote and got Wilson into office in the book. But the real key here is that out of the Inquiry was born the CFR. Out of the CFR came the War and Peace Studies. Out of the War and Peace Studies came the 1947 National Security Act. Out of that, you get the CIA. You get all these other alphabet soup agencies. So what people need to realize is if you look at these institutions and these, like let's say the CIA, for instance, if you look at the CIA as something that's part of our government and you've accepted what you were taught in school, that the government serves this specific purpose and it's there to protect your liberties and defend the Constitution and all these other things, it's hard to get your mind around what it's actually used for. So even like with the War and Peace studies, where the CFR was basically, it was so deeply embedded in the State Department, at that point it was already essentially a part of the State Department. Again, this is one of the goals that they said that they had to achieve, was to take over the diplomatic machinery of the United States of America. So that had already happened. But it doesn't mean everybody in the CFR knew it happened. Even that particular project was barely known. Obviously, it was known to Allen Dulles, and it was known to a handful of other elite insiders that were high-ranking within the CFR, but the vast majority of them didn't even know about this. They existed within that organization. And so out of that, these other organizations are born, and when you can look at it from that perspective, you can say, oh, okay, well, the CIA, the progenitors of the CIA, were people who wanted to subvert the democratic principles of the United States and actually use the United States as a machine as an engine to
1913 was the signing of the Federal Reserve Act, which was followed by the outbreak of World War I, ironically. But I think that we should talk briefly about the ideology and the mentality of this group. I see them as, you describe it best when you talk about Henry Kissinger, who is certainly one of the big practitioners.
My question to you, and I don't know if this went over the air, but it's going over the air right now. My question to you, Joseph Plummer, the author of Tragedy and Hope 101, is that given the fact that this Eastern Seaboard liberal Anglo-Saxon establishment, which took over the United States in 1912, that it's given that it's a collusion of government, of business, multinational corporations, of banking, certainly with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act and the takeover of our economic system by the bankers, given that the Federal Reserve is a private consortium of bankers who have been given monopoly power to control the issuance of our currency. And given their control, that's right, and given their international influence over our governments and the revolving door between them and our government, I think we should talk a little bit about what they believe in. What is their ideology? You describe it best when you mention Henry Kissinger, who was one of their main practitioners, and his reference to realpolitik. What do they believe in? Who are they? Do they have a moral code? And what are their goals?
Well, they do absolutely have a moral code. Unfortunately, that moral code is, if it works, then it's perfectly okay, and if it doesn't work, then it is not okay. So essentially, they measure right and wrong by a different set of standards than the average person. Quoting Carr, E.H. Carr, which is another high-ranking member, I cover him briefly in the book, there is no moral dimension. There is no moral dimension. Those are his words specifically, meaning that when a government, or Kissinger also follows this ideology and speaks about it unapologetically, that he uses Cardinal Richelieu as an example, that the state exists for its own purposes. And, though individual men can be judged negatively for their actions if they are immoral, as long as you're acting through the apparatus of the state, then morality no longer applies, because the state needs to do whatever it needs to do to maintain its interests and expand its power. So it makes no difference whether or not you're trampling the rights of individuals. It makes no difference whether you are literally just a sociopathic, lying, thieving murderer. It doesn't make any difference so long as you're serving the interest of the state. That is the excuse that's given. Conveniently enough for them, they are the state. Because what is the state if not just the individuals who direct the policies and resources of government? That's all the state is. They're individuals. So
that's right.
Now
go
ahead.
No, look, this idea has been around since time immemorial. I mean, I think it was Machiavelli who developed it in The Prince. But what we're talking about is how it came to dominate the United States and how far it's come. The United States was supposed to reform away from this. Thank you very much. And my guest is Joseph Plummer. The book is Tragedy and Hope 101, The Illusion of Justice, Freedom, and Democracy. Joseph, so we have this amoral, unethical world order establishment that has come to dominate our politics, our culture, our economy. Wilson comes to power, and I just want to talk about Wilson briefly because I think Wilson's a type of figure that is chosen by this establishment because he had he had a super ego. He really had a strong sense of himself, kind of a lightweight in the real sense, someone who could be manipulated in exchange for his operating as a servant of these interests, whether knowingly or otherwise. And he's typical of these types. I think that FDR was another example. Hitler was an example. I think Obama is a good example of this. Yeah, Bill Clinton.
All of them, Chuck.
There were very few.
They're vetted.
Very few of them stand up, and the few that do stand up, things don't end up so well. Like President John F. Kennedy, things didn't end up too well for him, and others. But the point is that they are intent upon dominating all aspects of our lives. I want to go back to the year 1912 because that was really the coup d'etat. That was the revolution. The year that Wilson was able to get in, and you recount the fascinating way they did this, and the very sinister character of Edward Mandell House, who was America's agent of this entity, and how they established themselves here. Talk a little bit about what happened that year and all of the things that were put in place.
Well, basically, you start out with a situation where Taft is set to win handily, and somehow yet they bring this obscure academic out of New Jersey, governor, and try to figure out how they're going to get him into power. So what does the establishment do? They bring back Teddy Roosevelt and dump millions and millions and millions of dollars into his campaign so they could split the vote. And Carroll Quigley talks about how they had actually done that in it wasn't an unfamiliar tactic to them. They had done it in Europe as well. So they essentially took the guaranteed winner by a landslide, Taft, and by the time they were done with their operation, they had managed to get the man that they really wanted, Woodrow Wilson, in by splitting the votes that would have gone to Taft between Taft and Teddy Roosevelt, and Taft ended up dead last. So I felt that was, they give you an example of people who don't understand how they can do things like this. That would be a perfect example of how you can take somebody who's favored to win and still, they have more power now, obviously. Now they completely choose who we're going to choose from. So that's part of the illusion of democracy as well, is this idea that they choose who the top-tier candidates are, and then everybody selects from those well-vetted establishment candidates. Like you said, men like Woodrow Wilson, who have a messiah complex and who have been thoroughly studied. Keep in mind, these people, especially at this point, can you imagine how much information they have on anybody before these people are tapped and supported and provided financial and media support? You can only imagine. So just from the perspective of like doing a general personality assessment of what this person's beliefs are and what they feel is or isn't the appropriate role of government or how ethical they are, all of these things, they have access to all this information. And a man like Woodrow Wilson at that time, who had been writing about a new world order or a federation of empires, as he called it, as early as the 1880s, he was the perfect candidate. By and far, a perfect candidate, especially that he knew nothing about central banking, which he admitted. And so, of course, Mandell House got to advise him on all of that. He was completely sympathetic to the idea of trampling civil liberties, obviously, the Espionage Act. Mm-hmm. Everything that essentially, for those who don't know, Mandell House actually wrote a book called Philip Drew Administrator. And in that book, he describes how this individual who wants to save the republic first has to destroy it and implement a tyranny, and all of these things that he talks about that would be necessary in order to do it, like an income tax, which didn't exist at the time, and all of these other elements that would need to be put forward. These are all the things that House, manipulating Wilson from behind the scenes, actually got put in place after he, House, the kingmaker, got Wilson into office. So it's really, it reads like a novel, but unfortunately it isn't.
Yes.
It can all be verified, and you can check all the sources, which I've literally got. I've got hundreds of footnotes in this book. I tried to condense it as much as I could because I know it's hard to get people to read these days, and they don't have a lot of time. But there are more footnotes than there are pages for those who want to check my sources and make sure everything's in context and learn more.
Okay, we're going to take another break here. Yeah, the book is Tragedy and Hope 101. It's a condensed Tragedy and Hope 101, The Illusion of Justice, Freedom, and Democracy, available at Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, at StopTheLie.com. Joseph, so what we have then is 2013 under Wilson, and you point out accurately all these guys are either blackmailed or they're willing and conscious participants, or things don't end up so good, as we've talked about. You've got the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, which basically transferred the monetary system to the private bankers. You've got the signing of the 16th Amendment, which allowed them to direct taxation of citizens for the first time in American history, except during the Civil War briefly. You've got a clause in the 16th Amendment which allows for the creation of nonprofit foundations so that the very wealthy can shield their money and use it to influence our culture. And by the way, more recently, when conservatives and Tea Partiers suddenly woke up and realized that they would like to use the same apparatus, they were met by Lois Lerner, who was like, sorry, fellas, this wasn't meant for you. This is meant for us.
Imagine that.
And thus, yeah, really. And thus you have also the coincidental outbreak of World War I with enormous profits made by the self-same bankers and a move toward internationalism, America dragged into the war, and then you've got the League of Nations. So onward and upward. The thing is slowed down by the election of Warren G. Harding, a good patriot, but it comes back with the election of FDR. Now, Franklin Roosevelt, something people need to understand is that in his inaugural address, and 1 week after he was inaugurated, he received emergency powers, and Congress signed on to it. And those emergency powers basically and essentially allowed him to declare war against the American people. I mean, these were war powers that were assumed extra-constitutional. And under those war powers, which are renewed every 2 years by Congress, Roosevelt set up all those alphabet agencies you talked about. The Supreme Court tried to stop it, in which case they got rid of one of the worst of the agencies, the EPA. Roosevelt responded by trying to pack the Supreme Court. You had the recognition of the Soviet Union, which allowed all of these pro-communist people into the inner circles of government, which I think contributed greatly to the demoralization, the amoral element of the establishment. I guess I should ask you, what was their role? You talk about their role of promoting Hitler into power as a project of the Anglo establishment. What was their role, if any, in the creation of the Bolsheviks and their advancement of communism, especially after World War II?
Yeah, if people want more information on that, Anthony Sutton has written quite a bit about it. I believe the title of the book is Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, I believe. I'm not 100% sure, but if you look up Anthony Sutton, you'll find how, this is just standard mode of operation. They create enemies. I cover also briefly in Chapter 1 of Tragedy and Hope 101, which I want to mention also. I wrote this book because I want people to read it, so they don't have to buy it. The book is available for free with all of the references, and everything's linked at tragedyandhope.info. So not .com, it's tragedyandhope.info. So if you're interested in getting more information on all of this, it's very difficult to condense it even further into just an interview. You can read the entire thing for free online. So anyway, though, with regard to communism, with regard to fascism, with regard to terrorism, it makes no difference if you trace the threads of where the funding, the actual equipment, the intelligence, all of these things are coming from this Western elite. That's how, so Anthony, like I said, Anthony Sutton gets into great detail how that there was no Russian threat, that the Russian threat was the best enemy that money could buy. This was the technology, the wealth transfer, the intelligence, the know-how, all of this stuff was provided by...
You mentioned Anthony Sutton's work, Bolsheviks in Wall Street, Hitler in Wall Street. Excellent work, absolutely. He was a Hoover Institute fellow. And he indicates that this same elite establishment that we think of conventionally as capitalist, that they funded and financed the Bolshevik Revolution, that they helped the Bolsheviks come to power, and that they had no objection to communism. In fact, they admired it. They viewed a top-down collectivist society as preferable to the Western notions of individual rights and individual sovereignty. Now, talk a little bit about that.
Anything that is a hierarchical structure is far easier for them to control. So if you'll notice that in the United States, they keep expanding the power of the executive. Why is that? Because if they actually have to try to, even if it's only 500 individuals, it's more difficult to control and buy off 500 individuals than it is to control and buy off just one individual. So the key to them, again, we go back to E.H. Carr, who openly stated that the totalitarianism of the communist regimes was far superior to the individualism practiced in Western society. Why? Because he's a member of the elite, and if you're a member of the elite, you do not want to be bothered at all. I mean, your ultimate goal is to completely eliminate the voice not only of the people, but of any real representation of some lesser body of individuals that are supposedly there to represent them. So, you absolutely want people to believe that they are being represented, but in reality, you want to completely eliminate any possibility whatsoever. I mean, the only law in their eyes is the law of power. That's it. And the only way to achieve real dominance at that level is through deception. So, deception, theft, and violence really are the core tenets of how they function. So if you look at it from that perspective, and again, here's the problem. The problem that I've begun to realize is that there's only a handful, and I'm not ripping on the rest of the population, but there's a small percentage of the population that can actually read this stuff and not be afraid of it.
Thank you very much. Joseph Plummer is my guest, Tragedy and Hope 101. Joseph, they've reached such a level of power at this point. I recently interviewed Professor Michael Glennon of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, who has inadvertently written a book that's similar to Carroll Quigley's. He's one of these liberal heads of a department who wrote a book called Double Government. I don't know if you've seen it. Check it out. He came on my show, and he talks about the Trumanites. He traces it back to Truman's development of the national security infrastructure when he, by executive order, created the CIA, the NSA, and the National Security Council. And he now says that this edifice gets $1 trillion a year, much of it off the books, that it employs millions of people, it's secretive, and that they control our government. They control our foreign policy and our national security. And he's right. I mean, this is... Go ahead.
Yeah, Chuck, again, and that was all born out of the War and Peace studies, which was the CFR, which was the inquiry, which was the same people. So he's going back to Truman. He's going back to the era. But I don't know that he traced further back to see, and again, like you said at the beginning of the show, we could go back prior to Rhodes, of course, because this is as old as history itself. But this group covered by Quigley, all of that, and those agencies all stem from this same group of individuals. And absolutely, as Quigley himself said, the expert will replace the Democratic voter. The Democratic voter, of course, is not going to be informed of this. He doesn't say that part, but I mean, that goes without saying. They're not going to tell the Democratic voter that their vote doesn't matter anymore. I believe he uses the term that there may be some choice still available to them, but it will be controlled within such narrow parameters that it won't matter. The expert is ultimately going to be the one that's directing our policies. And yes, absolutely, we are already at that point. It can become progressively worse, but they fill these positions with the arrogant individuals who I was getting to it before the break, that there's only a small percentage of the population that seems to be capable of actually, honestly assessing the evidence and subjectively, or not subjectively, rather, objectively looking at what the reality is. And those people tend to do one of two things. They either rebel against it or they join it. So, of course, there are people who psychologically derive a great sense of significance being on the inside, feeling superior to others because they are more intelligent, because they don't buy the propaganda, because they are part of the policy-making apparatus. And those are the ones, and let's assume that it's only about really 5% of the population that will actually look at this information and be able to handle it. Because this is the problem I've been facing at this point, that the solutions to what we face are going to come from those who are willing to look at the reality as laid out by Carroll Quigley. You tell the average voter what Carroll Quigley had to say about the expert replacing them and all this, they don't want to believe that. It scares them. They want to believe the fairy tale that they were taught in high school about how government works. It scares them for a lot of reasons. It can cost them the minute you realize that, oh my God, our government has literally been taken over and we're essentially slaves, where our money is being stolen and being used against us to destroy our civil liberties and destroy civil liberties around the world, to create this all-encompassing hell on earth, that's kind of scary. It ruins the ceaseless entertainments that are paraded in front of them to occupy their time. So the solutions, I think, are going to come from this small group of individuals who not only are aware of it, but who are fighting it. And in my view, this is going to be the disruptive technologies in media. We've already seen how that's helping, okay? Disruptive technologies in money, disruptive technologies in manufacturing, education, even in government. This is ultimately what we're going to have to focus on to try to do something about it, because in the current system, the way it's structured, it's hopeless. It's hopeless, because if the vast majority of individuals are unwilling to look at it, or too afraid to look at it, or too selfish, whatever word you want to use, I try not to, people are entitled to live their lives the way they want. The problem is if they pay no attention, then they empower these people who are destroying everything. So that bothers me. Right. But yeah. At the end of the day, that same mass of humanity, I imagine it has always been this way, a small percentage that actually implements the changes, and then the vast mass of humanity just goes along with whatever happens to be in place. So it's up to people like you, up to people like me, and all of the other millions and millions of individuals who are aware, to start trying to come up with ways to...
Important subject. We could talk about... you divide things very evenly and clearly between those who decide to get along and even benefit from the establishment once they realize what's going on, and those who have the courage to stand up against it. We only have a few more minutes left, so I'd like you to just talk a little bit about what more we can do and where people can get your book, how they can get more information. I hope you come back on with me regularly, but why don't we go right to that right now?
Well, the easiest way for anybody who wants immediate access to the information is to simply go to tragedyandhope.info. And there you can read the book for free, and if you decide you want to buy a copy, you'd like to have a hard copy, there'll be links available there. So, if you're certain that you want to purchase it or you want a sample, obviously, you can go to Amazon, and if you've got a Kindle, they'll send you a sample of the book, and you can read it a little bit more conveniently that way. The one thing that everybody can do is raise awareness. So nothing changes. There are no problems that can be changed until people are made aware of those problems. As I said, unfortunately, when you're trying to do this, you're going to encounter a lot of people who are just terrified of the implications of what you're saying. And so it doesn't matter. Like you said, you've had Tragedy and Hope is like a phone book. So it's difficult to get anybody to read something like that. It really is a chore to get through that. So you can understand that, but even condensing it down into the size of something like my book, which is just a couple hundred pages, it's going to take the average person about as much time as it would take them to watch a football game on Sunday to read it. It's no longer an issue of that being the barrier. The barrier is a psychological barrier. So if you're trying to raise awareness, you have to understand that you're going to encounter these psychological barriers. There are going to be people who just simply don't want to look at it, and you can't take it. And if they attack you, which is possible because you're going to disrupt their worldview and their comfort and all these things that they'd rather pay attention to, that you can't take it personally. You just have to understand that there are, as you continue to do that, you're going to come across the ones who will, and the more we have, the better off we're going to be, the more people we have on our side.